A woman starved herself to death in 1943, and scholars still can't agree whether it was suicide, martyrdom, or something far stranger. She was 34 years old, dying in an English sanatorium, refusing food while Europe burned. Her final request was to be sent to the front lines to share the rations of French soldiers. They said no. She died anyway, convinced that her suffering meant something the rest of us couldn't understand. This is Simone Weil, philosopher, mystic, factory worker, soldier, a woman who scored first on France's most prestigious academic exam, then spent a year operating a drill press in an auto plant, who wrote brilliantly about God despite never being baptized, who joined an anarchist militia in Spain despite being a committed pacifist. Nothing about her life makes sense until you stop trying to make it make sense. The contradictions start immediately. Paris, February 1909. She's born into a family that should have guaranteed her comfort, security, intellectual prestige. Her father, Bernard, was a successful physician. Her mother, Salomea, came from a prosperous merchant family. They were Jewish, but completely secular, thoroughly assimilated into French culture. The household valued education above everything. Young Simone should have had an easy path to academic success. She almost died as an infant instead. Appendicitis, severe enough that her survival seemed unlikely. She pulled through, but her health never recovered. For the next 34 years, headaches plagued her constantly. Respiratory problems, a frail constitution that made physical exertion difficult. Her body was failing before it had properly started. But her mind? That was something else entirely. At 6 years old, Simone quoted French poet Jean Racine from memory. Not simple verses, complex, sophisticated poetry that most adults struggled with. Her brother André, 3 years older, was already showing signs of mathematical genius. He'd become one of the 20th century's greatest mathematicians. The Weil household produced two prodigies, and they knew it. What they didn't expect was how Simone would use that prodigious mind. Most brilliant children become brilliant adults who live comfortable, accomplished lives. Simone took a different route. At age 5, she refused a gift, a necklace, because accepting luxury items was morally wrong when others had nothing. Not the performative gesture of a child seeking attention. A genuine moral conviction that troubled her deeply enough to reject something she probably wanted. The pattern continued. World War I broke out when she was 5. French soldiers were rationed, limited in what they could eat while fighting in the trenches. Simone heard about this and immediately stopped eating sugar. Just stopped. She was 6 years old, and the connection between her comfort and their suffering was already unbearably clear to her. Her father, Bernard, was conscripted, sent to the front as a military doctor. For years, he was absent. Simone and André were raised primarily by their mother Salomea, a woman with her own peculiarities. Salomea had an obsession with cleanliness that bordered on pathological. She feared germs the way some people fear death. By the time Simone turned 4, even her own parents had stopped kissing her. Too many germs, too much risk. The children washed their hands constantly. After washing, they had to open doors with their elbows to avoid contaminating their clean hands before meals. It sounds absurd, but this was daily reality in the Weil household. And Simone absorbed these anxieties, transformed them into something even more extreme. She barely ate, not just sugar, everything. Meals became ordeals. Food seemed to represent something dangerous to her, something contaminated. As a child, she cried if anyone touched her. The aversion to physical contact would last her entire life. Even with close friends, even with people she loved, she couldn't bear to be touched. Think about what that means. Growing up in a household where affection was already limited, where parental kisses stopped at age 4, where cleanliness mattered more than comfort. Then add a child's mind that took these restrictions and amplified them tenfold. Simone Weil's relationship with her own body was damaged from the start, and it never healed. But while her body suffered, her intellect soared. By 12, she was fluent in ancient Greek. not the simplified version taught in schools. She could read Homer, Sophocles, Euripides in the original language, understanding nuances that escaped most scholars. She devoured philosophy, literature, mathematics. André might have been the mathematical genius, but Simone matched him in sheer intellectual range. At 14, she hit a crisis. André's abilities were becoming impossible to ignore. He was solving problems that baffled professional mathematicians. Simone looked at her brother's genius and concluded she was mediocre by comparison. The depression that followed was severe enough that she later described it as contemplating suicide. Not because she couldn't succeed, she was already succeeding by any normal measure, but because she couldn't match her brother's transcendent gifts. What pulled her out wasn't accomplishment. It was a realization. Her moral sensitivity, the thing that made her refuse necklaces at 5 and sugar at 6, that was her gift. André could see mathematical patterns no one else perceived. Simone could see moral patterns with the same clarity. Suffering that others rationalized or ignored struck her with physical force. Most people learn to tune out injustice. We have to, or we'd never function. Simone couldn't do that, or wouldn't. When she learned about oppression, poverty, violence, it wasn't abstract, it was personal, immediate, unbearable. That capacity for moral attention became the foundation of everything she'd write and do. In October 1925, at 16, she enrolled at Henri IV Lycée in Paris. The school was preparing her for the entrance exam to École Normale Supérieure, France's most prestigious institution for training teachers and intellectuals. The curriculum was brutal. Students spent years drilling in philosophy, literature, languages, preparing for an exam that most failed. Simone's teacher was a man named Émile Auguste Chartier, known by his pen name Alain. He was a pacifist, a philosopher who emphasized intellectual independence and rigorous thinking. His classes covered Plato, Descartes, Spinoza, Kant, Homer, Aeschylus, Sophocles. He taught his students to question everything, to think for themselves rather than accepting received wisdom. For Simone, it was transformative. She'd always been critical of authority, skeptical of easy answers. Alain gave her the philosophical tools to turn that skepticism into a method. She began writing essays, using paradox and careful attention to expose contradictions in French society and philosophical tradition. Her style was already forming, dense, aphoristic, challenging. The entrance exam for École Normale Supérieure came in 1928. 2 women topped the list that year, a remarkable achievement given that the school had only recently started admitting women at all. Simone Weil placed first. Second was Simone de Beauvoir, who'd later become one of the 20th century's most important feminist philosophers. 30 male students followed. The 2 Simones met. De Beauvoir later wrote, "I envied her for having a heart that could beat right across the world." But their philosophies diverged immediately. In one famous exchange, Weil declared that only one thing mattered now: the revolution that would feed all the starving people on Earth. De Beauvoir disagreed. The problem wasn't making people happy, it was finding meaning for human existence. Weil looked at her. "It's easy to see you've never gone hungry." That encapsulates everything. For de Beauvoir, philosophy was about consciousness, freedom, abstract meaning. For Weil, philosophy that ignored concrete human suffering was worthless. You couldn't theorize from comfort about other people's pain. You had to experience it, share it, understand it from the inside. At École Normale Supérieure, she gained a reputation. The Red Virgin, they called her. She was intransigent, revolutionary, impossible to ignore. She marched with workers, wrote for leftist publications, challenged her professors. Most brilliant students at France's elite institutions became comfortable intellectuals. Simone became a problem. She completed her studies in 1931, writing a thesis on science and perception in Descartes. The degree qualified her to teach philosophy at the secondary level. She was assigned to a girls' lycée in Le Puy, a small town in the Massif Central region. Remote, provincial, the kind of place ambitious young intellectuals usually resented. Simone didn't care about ambition in that sense. She cared about workers, about justice, about putting her ideas into practice. Le Puy gave her the opportunity to do something most philosophers never attempted, to actually live according to her principles. She moved to the town in autumn 1931. France was sliding into economic depression. Unemployment was rising. Workers were organizing, striking, demanding basic rights. The political situation was volatile. Fascism was growing in Germany and Italy. The Soviet Union's experiment with communism was revealing its brutalities. The old certainties were collapsing. For someone like Simone Weil, raised on comfortable abstractions in Paris, this should have been a shock. It wasn't. She'd been preparing for this her entire life. Those childhood refusals, the sugar, the necklace, they weren't quirks, they were rehearsals for something larger. She began teaching philosophy to teenage girls. The curriculum was standard: Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Kant. But Simone's approach wasn't standard. She pushed her students to think critically, to question authority, to connect philosophical ideas with political reality. She treated them as intellectual equals rather than empty vessels to be filled with information. The school administration noticed, so did the parents. This young teacher was too political, too radical. She didn't just teach philosophy, she lived it, visibly, uncomfortably. She attended union meetings. She marched with striking workers. She wrote articles for leftist journals under various pseudonyms, and she lived like her students' working-class parents. While other teachers from bourgeois backgrounds maintained their comfortable lifestyles, Simone restricted herself to the same rations available to those on unemployment relief. She gave away most of her salary. She dressed simply, ate minimally, refused any luxury that couldn't be shared by everyone. This wasn't performance. Nobody was forcing her. She could have taken the teaching position, done competent work, enjoyed a comfortable middle-class existence. Most people in her position did exactly that. Simone found that morally intolerable. But here's what's crucial to understand. This wasn't asceticism for its own sake. She wasn't trying to purify herself through denial. She was trying to understand, how do you write about oppression from a position of comfort? How do you claim solidarity with workers while living in a different world? You can't, not honestly, so she tried to close the gap. Her colleagues thought she was mad. Her family worried constantly. Her health, already fragile, deteriorated under the strain. The headaches worsened. She was exhausted, frequently ill, but she kept pushing, kept trying to understand what it meant to live without the cushion of privilege. In 1933, she wrote an essay titled Reflections Concerning the Causes of Liberty and Social Oppression. It's one of the most important pieces of her early political philosophy. In it, she analysed how modern society creates new forms of oppression that Marx hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about who owned the means of production. It was about the structure of work itself, the way modern and industrial systems reduced humans to machine components, stripped away their agency and dignity. Most Marxist intellectuals were writing about the proletariat from university offices. Simone was writing from experience, or trying to. She was teaching in Le Puy, yes, but teaching wasn't factory work. It wasn't the brutal, dehumanizing labor that millions endured. So she decided to do something almost no intellectual of her generation attempted. She would become a factory worker herself. This decision marks the real turning point. Everything before was preparation. The childhood sensitivity to suffering, the refusal of luxury, the political activism, it all led here, to a choice that would transform her understanding of oppression, suffering, and what it means to be human in a world built on exploitation. What happened next would break her in ways she never anticipated. but it would also give her insights that no amount of theoretical study could provide. She was about to learn what it actually meant to be at the bottom of the industrial system, and that knowledge would haunt everything she wrote for the rest of her brief life. In June 1934, Simone applied for a leave of absence from teaching. The official reason was health. The real reason was an experiment that would nearly destroy her. She was going to work in a factory, not as an observer or researcher, as an actual worker. One of the unskilled women labourers at the bottom of the industrial hierarchy, paid only for what they produced, subject to the same quotas and disciplines as everyone else. Her friends thought she'd lost her mind. Her family was horrified. Even her fellow leftists questioned the logic. What could this possibly accomplish? She had a good job, influence through her writing and teaching. Why throw that away to spend a year operating machinery? But Simone had identified a problem that gnawed at her. Every intellectual who wrote about the working class did so from outside. They had theories about oppression, elaborate analyses of class struggle, sophisticated critiques of capitalism, and none of them actually knew what it felt like to be at the bottom. Marx himself had never worked in a factory. Neither had any of the prominent Marxist theorists. They studied workers the way biologists study insects, from a safe distance, through the lens of theory. The distance wasn't just physical, it was existential. They couldn't write about liberation because they didn't know what slavery felt like. Simone believed you couldn't understand oppression abstractly. You had to live it, feel it in your body, in the exhaustion at the end of each day, in the constant fear of failing to meet your quota, the humiliation when a supervisor screamed at you, the way time stretched and compressed under the pressure of mechanical repetition. She knew this would be difficult. She had no illusions about her abilities. She was clumsy, physically weak, prone to illness. Factory work would be brutal, but that was precisely the point. She needed to experience what most workers experienced, the grinding down of the body and spirit that industrial labour demanded. On December 4th, 1934, she started work at Alstom, an electrical factory in Paris. Her job was to operate a press that cut metal parts. The work required speed, precision, and constant attention. Mess up, and you damaged expensive materials. Mess up repeatedly, and you'd be fired. Within the first week, she was crying. Not metaphorically, actually weeping violently at the end of each shift. Her journal entries from this period are almost unbearable to read. The physical pain was constant. Her hands blistered, then bled. The noise was deafening, making her existing headaches excruciating. But worse than the physical suffering was something else. The humiliation. She'd expected the work to be hard. She'd expected to be tired. What she hadn't anticipated was the systematic degradation built into every aspect of factory life. The way supervisors treated workers not as humans, but as malfunctioning machines. The arbitrary rules designed to assert dominance rather than improve efficiency. The constant surveillance, the impossible production targets, the knowledge that you were utterly replaceable. In her factory journal, she wrote that time itself became a burden. Each minute dragged, weighed down by exhaustion and the need to maintain impossible speeds. Her mind, usually so active and engaged, shut down. There was no space for thought, only the mechanical repetition of tasks, the fear of falling behind, the supervisor's voice cutting through the noise with criticism and threats. She was terrible at the work. Her clumsiness, which had been merely embarrassing in her previous life, became a crisis. She couldn't meet the production quotas. Parts she'd worked on were rejected as defective. The supervisor warned her, "If they're fucked up, you've had it." The other workers noticed her struggling. Some were kind, showing her shortcuts, helping when they could. Others resented her presence, sensing correctly that she was different, that she didn't belong there, that she could leave whenever she wanted while they were trapped. And they were right. Simone could leave. She had a teaching position waiting for her, a comfortable apartment, a family with resources. The other women had nothing. They were there because they had no choice, because their families needed the income, because the alternative was starvation. This knowledge ate at her. She'd come to understand their experience, to close the gap between intellectual and worker. But the gap couldn't be closed. Not really. She could choose to suffer. They couldn't choose not to. After 3 months at Alstom, she moved to a different factory, then another. Each job was similar, the same grinding repetition, the same exhaustion, the same humiliation. She worked at Carnot, a metalworks factory, then at Renault, the automobile plant. Everywhere, the pattern repeated. What shocked her most wasn't the physical hardship. It was the psychological impact. The way factory work didn't just tire you, it broke something inside. Your sense of agency, of dignity, of being a person who mattered. The industrial system treated humans as interchangeable parts, and gradually, horrifyingly, you began to see yourself that way. She noticed something else too. The expected rebellion didn't happen. Marxist theory predicted that oppressed workers would develop class consciousness, recognize their exploitation, rise up against their oppressors. But what Simone saw was the opposite. The more brutal the conditions, the more docile the workers became. This wasn't because they were stupid or lacked revolutionary spirit. It was because exhaustion and humiliation destroyed the capacity for resistance. When every ounce of energy goes into surviving the day, when your sense of self has been systematically dismantled, when you've internalized the message that you're worthless and replaceable, you don't organize, you endure. The factory, she realized, was a machine for producing obedience, not through ideology or propaganda, but through the direct assault on human dignity that industrial labor represented. Marx had analyzed economic exploitation brilliantly, but he'd missed this deeper form of oppression. The way modern production methods didn't just extract surplus value, they extracted humanity itself. Her journal entries from this period are fragmentary, exhausted, barely coherent at times. Every moment hurts. I am nothing. The soul is killed. These aren't philosophical observations. They're cries from someone drowning. She lasted almost a year. By August 1935, she was completely broken. Her health had collapsed entirely. The headaches were constant and debilitating. She'd lost weight she couldn't afford to lose. Her hands were scarred and damaged, but the physical injuries weren't the worst part. Something inside her had changed permanently. Before the factory, she'd believed in human dignity as an abstract principle. Now she knew it could be destroyed, systematically, through the ordinary operations of industrial capitalism. She'd experienced what she'd later call affliction, a state of suffering so total that it erased the self. The factory year transformed everything. Her political philosophy became grounded in lived experience rather than theory. Her understanding of oppression deepened from an economic analysis to an existential one. And her writing took on a new urgency, a new authority born from having been there, having felt the weight of what she described. But there was something else, something unexpected. In Portugal that August, recovering from her factory ordeal, she attended a religious procession. Fishermen's wives carried a statue of their patron saint through the village, singing ancient hymns. And suddenly, watching these people who had nothing, who lived lives of grinding poverty and hardship, Simone understood something. Christianity wasn't the opiate of the masses. It was their cry of pain and their source of dignity. These women singing hymns weren't deluded by false consciousness. They were asserting their humanity in the only way available to them, declaring that despite everything, despite the poverty and suffering and endless labor, they mattered. They were beloved of God. The conviction came to her with overwhelming force. Christianity was the religion of slaves, because only slaves truly needed it. Only those at the bottom could understand what it meant to believe in a God who valued the worthless, who elevated the humiliated, who promised that the last would be first. She wrote later that this realization changed everything. She'd gone to the factory as a Marxist intellectual, trying to understand the proletariat. She came out as something else entirely, someone who'd glimpsed both the depths of human suffering and the mysterious ways people survived it. The factory experience gave her knowledge no book could provide, but it also raised questions she couldn't answer through politics alone. Questions about suffering, about dignity, about what sustained people when everything else was stripped away. These questions would lead her somewhere completely unexpected, away from revolutionary politics and towards something that looked, impossibly, like religious faith. Not the comfortable religion of the bourgeoisie, but something raw and necessary, forged in the same fire that had nearly destroyed her. The woman who emerged from the factories wasn't the same person who'd entered. She'd wanted to understand oppression. She'd succeeded. But understanding came at a cost. She'd seen too much, felt too much. The knowledge would shape everything she wrote for the rest of her life. And time was running out, though she didn't know it yet. Spain was supposed to be different. That's what Simone told herself in the summer of 1936 when she heard about the Civil War. Here, finally, was a fight worth fighting. Not the abstract revolution she'd written about, but a real one. Fascism against the people, oppression against freedom. Black and white, clear as daylight. She was wrong about that too. The Spanish Civil War broke out in July 1936, when nationalist generals led by Francisco Franco attempted a military coup against Spain's democratically elected Republican government. The country split. On one side, the nationalists, supported by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy. On the other, the Republicans, a fractious coalition of communists, anarchists, socialists, and liberals. Simone heard the news and made her decision immediately. She'd go to Spain. She'd fight. This sounds insane when you remember that she was a committed pacifist. She'd spent years arguing that violence was never justified, that war was the ultimate evil, that nothing good could come from killing. She'd written extensively about how warfare corrupted even just causes, how the machinery of violence destroyed the souls of those who used it. And now she wanted a gun. The contradiction didn't escape her. Years later, in a letter, she'd tried to explain it. She wrote that she'd gone to Spain despite her pacifism, not abandoning it, but suspending it, because fascism represented something so evil that even violence was justified to stop it. It wasn't a comfortable position. It tore at something inside her, but she went anyway. She obtained credentials as a journalist and made her way to Barcelona. The city was in chaos, glorious chaos to some, terrifying to others. The anarchists had taken control. They'd collectivized businesses, abolished money in some areas, declared the revolution successful. Red and black flags hung everywhere. Armed workers patrolled the streets. The old order had collapsed, and something new was being born in its wreckage. Simone sought out Julian Gorkin, a commander in the anti-fascist militia. She had a proposal. She wanted to be sent on a dangerous mission, a covert operation to rescue Joaquin Morin, a political prisoner being held by the nationalists. It would require infiltrating enemy territory, passing as a Spaniard, risking execution if caught. Gorkin looked at this tiny, nearsighted French intellectual and said no, not because he doubted her courage, but because the mission was suicide. She'd never pass as Spanish. Her accent would give her away immediately. She'd be caught and shot, and Maureen would still be in prison. They argued for over an hour. Simone insisted she had every right to sacrifice herself if she chose. Gorkin refused to let her waste her life on an impossible mission. Finally, she gave up on the rescue plan and asked to join a fighting unit instead. Gorkin directed her to the Sebastian IV Century, a French-speaking section of the anarchist Durruti column. They specialised in high-risk commando operations, exactly the kind of unit where someone could get killed quickly. The Durruti column was named after Buenaventura Durruti, a legendary anarchist militant. His fighters were known for their courage and their chaos, often in equal measure. They weren't professional soldiers. They were workers and intellectuals and revolutionaries, united by idealism and a willingness to die for the cause. Simone joined them in August 1936. She was issued a uniform and a rifle. She drilled with the other volunteers. She learned to march, to follow orders, to prepare for combat. Her comrades quickly realized they had a problem. Simone was almost blind without her glasses. She was clumsy. She'd never handled a weapon before. They spent more time keeping her away from guns than teaching her to use them, terrified she'd accidentally shoot one of them. But she was determined. She wrote to a friend that she was finally doing something real, something that mattered. Not talking about revolution, but making it happen. 20 days into her service, on August 20th, she was cooking with her unit when she stepped backward into a pot of boiling oil. The burn was severe, covering her lower left leg and foot. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. She was evacuated from the front, treated by medics, and eventually taken to a hospital in Sitges, a coastal town near Barcelona. Her parents, who'd been frantically searching for her, finally found her there. They were horrified. Their daughter, the philosophy professor, lying in a hospital bed with a terrible burn, having nearly gotten herself killed fighting in a war that wasn't hers. They insisted she come home. The injury made the decision for her. She couldn't fight anymore, not with that leg. After recovering enough to travel, she left Spain. The accident probably saved her life. The Sebastian IV century continued fighting after she left. Most of them died in the battles that followed. But Spain changed her in ways that had nothing to do with the burn. She'd gone expecting to find a pure cause, a righteous fight. What she found instead was complexity and horror that ideology couldn't explain away. Years later, she'd write about what she'd seen there, not just the fascists' brutality, which she'd expected, but her own side's violence. She witnessed Republican militia execute a captured priest. She saw them kill a 15-year-old boy who refused to join their ranks. These weren't accidents or exceptions. This was what happened in war, even wars fought for good reasons. The anarchists she fought alongside were genuine believers. They wanted to create a society without oppression, without hierarchy, without the state. Noble goals, but achieving those goals required killing people, lots of people. And once you started killing, once you decided that violence was justified because your cause was right, something shifted. The violence became easier. The executions became routine. The line between fighting oppression and becoming oppressors yourself got harder to see. Simone understood that she was complicit. She'd picked up a rifle. She'd been willing to kill. The fact that she'd been too clumsy to actually shoot anyone didn't absolve her. The intention had been there. This realization haunted her. She'd violated her own deepest convictions. And for what? The Republic would eventually lose anyway. Franco would win. The fascists would control Spain for decades. All that death, all that suffering, and it changed nothing. But there was something else, something she observed that disturbed her even more deeply. The casual way violence became normalized, how quickly people adapted to killing, how the extraordinary became ordinary. She wrote about a conversation she'd had with a young Republican soldier. He'd just come back from executing prisoners, fascist sympathizers captured behind their lines. She asked him how he felt about it. He shrugged. They had to be eliminated, he said, as if discussing removing weeds from a garden. This was a working-class kid, probably 19 or 20. A few months earlier, he'd been a factory worker or a farmhand. Now he was casually discussing executing human beings. The war had done that to him. The cause had done that to him. And Simone recognized that it could have done the same to her, would have done the same if she'd stayed long enough, if circumstances had required it. That's what war did. It transformed decent people into killers, and it did it so gradually they didn't notice the change. She left Spain in September 1936, physically injured and spiritually shaken. The burn would heal, the other wounds wouldn't. The Spanish experience destroyed her faith in revolutionary politics. Not the goals of revolution, she still believed in justice, in equality, in fighting oppression, but the methods, the idea that you could build a better world through violence, through force, she couldn't believe that anymore. She'd seen what force did, even when wielded by the oppressed against their oppressors, even when justified by the noblest intentions, force corrupted. It created new victims, new hierarchies, new forms of oppression. The revolution devoured its children, and then it devoured anyone else within reach. This insight would become central to her later political philosophy. She'd write about how force, once unleashed, followed its own logic. It didn't matter who controlled it or what they claimed to be fighting for. Force was a mechanism that turned people into things, subjects into objects, human beings into instruments. The fascists used force to crush the working class. The revolutionaries used force to fight the fascists. But both sides in using force participated in the same fundamental crime: the reduction of human beings to means rather than ends. This didn't mean all sides were equally guilty. Fascism was worse, obviously. Fighting fascism was justified. But justification didn't erase the moral cost. You couldn't kill people, even bad people, even people who deserved it, without damaging something essential in yourself. Spain taught her that there are some moral dilemmas that can't be resolved, some situations where every choice is wrong, where you're forced to sin regardless of what you do, and that recognizing this, staying conscious of the evil, even when you're forced to participate in it, that was the only way to remain human. Back in France, recovering from her injury, Simone tried to process what she'd experienced. The burn healed slowly. The memories didn't heal at all. She wrote about Spain, trying to articulate what she'd learned, but the essays were difficult, contradictory. She kept circling back to the same problems without finding solutions. How do you fight evil without becoming evil yourself? How do you use force without being corrupted by it? How do you maintain moral clarity in situations where every option involves doing harm? She didn't have answers, just questions that kept multiplying, and something else was happening to her, something she couldn't quite name. The political categories she'd used her entire life, oppressor and oppressed, capitalism and socialism, revolution and reaction, they weren't wrong exactly, but they weren't sufficient anymore. They didn't account for what she'd felt in that Portuguese village, watching the fishermen's wives sing hymns. They didn't explain the strange comfort she'd found in their faith, the way their poverty seemed almost dignified when framed by ritual and belief. She'd gone to Spain seeking revolution. What she'd found instead was evidence that humans needed something beyond politics, beyond economics, beyond the material world entirely. They needed meaning. They needed transcendence. They needed, God help her, religion. This terrified her. She was a rationalist, a materialist, someone who'd built her entire worldview on reason and observable reality. Religion was superstition, opiate of the masses, false consciousness, designed to keep workers docile. Except it wasn't. Not entirely. Not for those Portuguese women. Not for the Spanish peasants who prayed before going into battle. Their faith wasn't just ideology or delusion. It was something real, something that sustained them in ways politics never could. Simone didn't want to accept this. She fought against it. But the factory experience and the Spanish experience had broken something in her certainties. She'd seen too much suffering that couldn't be explained by economics alone. She'd witnessed too many people finding strength in sources that Marxism insisted didn't exist. In April 1937, still recovering from Spain, she went to Italy. Her parents took her, hoping the trip would help her heal, both physically and mentally. They visited Florence, Rome, Assisi. Assisi was a small town in Umbria, famous for one thing. St. Francis had lived there in the 13th century. The town was filled with churches and monasteries dedicated to his memory. Simone wasn't particularly interested in saints or churches, but her parents wanted to see the Basilica of Santa Maria degli Angeli, so she went along. The basilica was Baroque, ornate, exactly the kind of religious architecture she usually found distasteful. But inside the grand building, there was something else, a tiny chapel, ancient and simple, called the Porziuncola. This was where St. Francis had prayed, where he'd founded his order, where he'd experienced his own mystical visions. Simone stepped into the small space. Something happened. She would later describe it as an irresistible force, something stronger than herself, compelling her to her knees. She'd never knelt in prayer before. She'd never prayed at all, not really. But in that moment, she couldn't help herself. What she experienced in that chapel, she could never fully explain, not even to herself. It wasn't a vision or a voice. It was more like a presence, an overwhelming sense of something beyond her understanding, something that demanded acknowledgement. She knelt. She stayed there for a long time. When she finally stood up and left the chapel, she was different. She didn't understand how or why, but something had shifted permanently, fundamentally. The atheist intellectual who'd spent her life believing in nothing but human reason and political struggle had just encountered something that transcended both, and she had no idea what to do about it. She didn't tell anyone at first. How could she explain something she couldn't understand herself? She was a philosopher, someone who built arguments on logic and evidence. What happened in Assisi wasn't logical. It wasn't something you could prove or demonstrate or analyze. It just was. Back in Paris, she tried to return to normal life. She continued teaching, writing political essays, attending union meetings. But something had cracked open. The questions she'd always asked about justice and suffering now had a different dimension. What if Marx was right about economic exploitation, but wrong about everything else? What if humans needed more than bread and freedom? What if they needed, she could barely think it, grace? The word felt foreign in her mind. Grace. It belonged to religious people, to believers, to those who accepted things without questioning. She'd spent her entire intellectual life questioning everything. But in that chapel, something had questioned her. Something had demanded acknowledgement, and she'd given it. She started reading differently. The Bible, which she'd studied as literature, suddenly felt like it was reading her instead of the other way around. The Gospels especially. Christ's words about the poor, about suffering, about losing your life to find it. These weren't just ethical teachings anymore. They were descriptions of something real, something she touched in that moment on her knees. Her friends noticed the change, though she tried to hide it. She was talking less about revolution and more about spirituality, less about organizing workers and more about the nature of suffering itself. Some thought she was having a breakdown. Others thought she'd betrayed the cause. A few understood that she was following her thoughts wherever they led, even if that meant abandoning positions she'd held for years. In 1938, everything intensified. Her headaches, which had plagued her since childhood, were getting worse. Severe, debilitating pain that lasted for days. Her mother suggested they take a trip during Easter week. The Abbey of Solms, a Benedictine monastery famous for its Gregorian chant. Simone went reluctantly. She wasn't interested in monasteries or monks or religious ritual, but the headaches were unbearable, and maybe the change of scene would help. It didn't. The pain continued, sharp and relentless. But something else happened. The monks sang. Every day, multiple times, they performed the liturgy with ancient chants that dated back centuries. Simone sat in the abbey church, her head splitting with pain, listening to voices that seemed to come from somewhere beyond time. The Latin words, the melody, the rhythm, it bypassed her intellect entirely and went straight to something deeper. A young man introduced himself, English or possibly American. She never quite remembered which. He was Catholic, serious about his faith in a way that embarrassed her slightly. He talked about poetry, about the English metaphysical poets of the 17th century. George Herbert especially. Had she read him? She hadn't. He gave her a book. She read it that night, despite the headache. One poem stopped her. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back. It was about a soul's reluctance to accept divine love, about feeling unworthy, about being invited to a feast you don't deserve. The final lines, Christ as host insisting, "You must sit down," says love, "and taste my meat." So I did sit and eat. She memorized it immediately, started reciting it to herself, especially during the worst headaches. The rhythm helped somehow, gave her something to focus on, besides the pain. She would say the words over and over, letting them fill her mind. And then it happened. She was reciting the poem, concentrating on the words to push away the pain, when something broke through. Not a vision, exactly. Not a voice, but a presence, undeniable and overwhelming. Christ himself came down and took possession of me. That's how she described it later. Those exact words. Not that she imagined Christ or felt inspired by the idea of Christ, but that Christ himself, actually, physically, spiritually, she could never quite say which, came down and possessed her. And it lasted maybe seconds, maybe longer. Time didn't work normally. When it ended, she was different. Not changed in any way she could point to. No sudden beliefs or conversions, just different, marked, claimed. She tried to rationalize it afterward. Maybe it was the headache, some kind of neurological event. Maybe the lack of food, she never ate enough. Maybe stress or exhaustion, or some combination. But she knew these explanations were inadequate. What happened was real. More real than anything else in her life. And it had nothing to do with her will or her intellect or her choices. This terrified her more than anything in Spain had. In Spain, she'd faced death and found it comprehensible. This was incomprehensible. God, if that's what this was, had acted without her permission, had invaded her consciousness despite all her defences. She hadn't chosen this. It had chosen her. She still didn't get baptised. The priests she talked to couldn't understand why. You've had a mystical experience of Christ, you believe in God, you love the church's teachings. Why not become Catholic? But Simone couldn't. The institutional church, with its history of crusades and inquisitions and political power, repelled her. The mystical Christ she'd encountered was something else entirely. Pure love, pure suffering, pure truth. The church as an organisation seemed almost opposed to that purity. Plus, there was the problem of her Jewishness. Not that she'd ever practiced Judaism or felt particularly Jewish. Her family was completely secular. But in 1938, being Jewish in Europe meant something specific and terrible. Hitler had annexed Austria. The Nuremberg laws were in full effect. Her own country was beginning to discuss Jewish quotas. To convert to Catholicism now felt like abandoning people who were suffering precisely because they were Jewish. So she stayed outside. Not Jewish, not Catholic, not anything. Just someone who'd encountered Christ and didn't know what to do about it. She kept teaching, kept writing, kept involving herself in political causes, but now everything had a different quality. The suffering she saw in factories and slums wasn't just economic oppression anymore. It was something spiritual, something connected to Christ's own suffering. She developed a theology, though she'd never call it that. Affliction, she called it. Not just suffering, but a specific kind of suffering that reduces humans to things. The factory workers she'd laboured beside hadn't just been exploited economically. They'd been afflicted, pushed to the absolute limits of what a human could endure and remain human. And in that affliction, she'd found something almost sacred. The workers in their humiliation resembled Christ in his crucifixion. This idea obsessed her. Christ hadn't come as a king or a philosopher or a revolutionary leader. He'd come as someone afflicted, tortured, killed in the most humiliating way Romans could devise. And in that ultimate affliction, he'd somehow revealed God. The cross wasn't despite the suffering. The suffering was the point. She wrote about this constantly. Letters, essays, notebooks, filled with thoughts about affliction and grace and the nature of God's love. She read voraciously. Greek philosophy, Hindu texts, Buddhist sutras. She found truth everywhere, in every tradition. Christianity wasn't unique in its doctrines. What was unique was the cross, the idea that God himself had chosen affliction. Her writing became stranger, more mystical, harder to categorize. Was it philosophy? Theology? Poetry? She didn't care about categories. She was trying to describe something that couldn't really be described. How do you explain that you've been possessed by Christ? How do you make that make sense to people who haven't experienced it? Most people thought she'd lost her mind. Even sympathetic friends worried. The brilliant young philosopher who'd been so sharp and political was now writing about supernatural grace and decreation and the need to love God by destroying the self. It sounded like madness, but it wasn't madness. It was the most sane she'd ever been. Everything before, all the politics and activism and intellectual arguments, had been preparation. She'd had to exhaust every other answer before she could accept the real one. Human effort wasn't enough. Political revolution wasn't enough. Even justice and equality weren't enough. Humans needed God, and God had revealed himself in the most unexpected way possible. Through affliction, the world was falling apart around her. By 1939, war was inevitable. France would fall. She knew it. The Nazis would win, at least initially. Everything she'd fought for politically was about to be destroyed. And somehow this made her faith stronger, not weaker. Because if God revealed himself through suffering, then the coming catastrophe wasn't meaningless. It was, God help them all, meaningful in ways she was only beginning to understand. She wrote to a priest, Father Perrin, trying to explain. She couldn't be baptized, she said, but she believed everything the church taught. She loved Christ with a love so intense it frightened her. She wanted to participate in the sacraments, but felt called to stay outside. She was convinced God wanted her there, on the threshold, neither fully in nor fully out. Father Perrin didn't understand. How could he? But he was patient with her. Let her work through her thoughts. Didn't push. She needed that. Someone who would listen to her theological struggles without trying to resolve them too quickly. She kept having experiences, not as dramatic as solism, but real. Moments when the presence returned, when she felt absolutely certain of God's love despite every rational objection her mind could produce. She didn't seek these moments. They came unbidden, usually when she was exhausted or in pain, or completely focused on something else. That was the pattern. Grace came when you weren't looking for it, when you'd given up trying to achieve it through effort. You had to wait, empty yourself, become nothing. And then maybe, if God willed it, something would fill that nothingness. Not something you created or earned, something given. She called this decreation. The self had to be destroyed, not through suicide or self-hatred, but through a kind of spiritual kenosis. You made space for God by removing yourself. Not your body or your mind, but your ego, your will, your sense of being the center of your own universe. Christ had emptied himself to become human. Humans had to empty themselves to receive God. This wasn't popular theology. It sounded too much like annihilation, too much like death. But Simone insisted it was the opposite. Only by losing the false self could you find the true self. Only by dying could you live. This was what Christ meant by taking up your cross. Not literal crucifixion, but the daily death of everything in you that wasn't love. She was writing all this down in notebooks, letters, essays, the most profound Christian theology being produced anywhere in Europe, and almost nobody read it. A few friends, Father Perrin, one or two others. She had no audience, no platform, no intention of publishing. She was just thinking out loud, trying to understand what had happened to her and what it meant. Human beings are so made that the ones who do the crushing feel nothing. It is the person crushed who feels what is happening. Unless one has placed oneself on the side of the oppressed, to feel with them, one cannot understand. She was convinced this was the moment she'd been preparing for. Everything. The factory, Spain, the mystical experiences had led here. France needed her. Not her philosophy, not her theology, her body, her willingness to die. The Free French government in London didn't know what to do with her. She showed up with a plan so insane it could only have come from someone who'd never seen actual combat. She wanted to be parachuted behind enemy lines as a frontline nurse, not stationed safely in a field hospital. Right there, where bullets were flying and men were dying. She'd tend the wounded under fire, she said, prove that courage existed, demonstrate that someone cared enough to risk everything. They tried to explain that this wasn't how war worked. Nurses stayed behind the lines for good reasons. You couldn't help anyone if you were dead. And besides, she was frail, sick, half blind. She'd be killed within hours. She insisted this was her calling, the thing she'd been born to do. They needed to understand. Someone had to show that love was stronger than force. The officials were patient. They gave her work instead. Analysis, reports, bureaucratic tasks. She wrote memoranda about post-war reconstruction, about how to reorganize French society along more just lines. Brilliant stuff, actually. Ideas about decentralization, workers' councils, spiritual renewal. Nobody read them. They filed her papers and hoped she'd settle into being useful in a normal way. She wouldn't settle. She kept pushing for her parachute mission, kept insisting they were wasting her. She wrote to everyone she could think of, explaining her plan in greater and greater detail. The more they refused, the more elaborate her proposals became. She'd lead a team of nurses, all volunteers willing to die. They'd carry minimal supplies, they'd be a symbol, a witness to something beyond military strategy. The answer remained no. Always no. She wasn't qualified, wasn't healthy, wasn't thinking clearly. They were kind about it mostly, but firm. So she did what she could. She worked in the French resistance offices in London, producing reports and analysis that demonstrated her usual brilliance and her usual impracticality in equal measure. She wrote about the spiritual crisis of modern civilization, about how Europe had lost touch with its roots. She proposed solutions that would have required remaking society from the ground up. She was living in a tiny room, eating almost nothing, and writing as if the world might actually listen. Her parents were in New York, safe. She'd left them there deliberately. This had to be done alone. Her mother wrote letters begging her to eat more, to take care of herself. Simone wrote back with descriptions of her work and assurances that she was fine. She wasn't fine. She was dying, and she knew it. The headaches were constant now, the exhaustion overwhelming. She'd catch herself falling asleep while writing, her hand still moving across the page, producing illegible scrawls. Her body was shutting down, but her mind kept working, kept pushing forward, kept trying to articulate what she'd learned about God and suffering and the nature of reality. She wrote a book-length manuscript called The Need for Roots. It was supposed to be practical guidance for reconstructing France after liberation. Instead, it turned into a diagnosis of everything wrong with modern civilization and a prescription for spiritual renewal that would have required overturning every assumption of contemporary life. She argued that people needed roots, connections to place, and tradition and community, that modern society's obsession with progress and efficiency had severed these connections, leaving everyone spiritually homeless. The analysis was profound. The solutions were impossible. Rebuild village life, restore traditional crafts, make work meaningful again, create communities based on shared spiritual values rather than economic efficiency. She was describing a world that had vanished, if it ever existed. She was trying to imagine her way back before the Industrial Revolution, before the Enlightenment, before everything that made the modern world modern. Nobody was going to implement this. Nobody could. But she wrote it anyway, with the same intensity she brought to everything, as if getting the words right might somehow matter. The manuscript took everything she had left. When she finished, she was too weak to walk without assistance. The doctors examined her and found tuberculosis, severe malnutrition, complete physical collapse. They put her in a sanatorium in Kent. She refused to eat more than the rations available to people in occupied France. This was her final political act. Solidarity with the suffering carried to its logical conclusion. She would share their deprivation, even here, even now. The doctors pleaded. Her friends begged. She remained firm. She couldn't eat while people in France were starving. It would be wrong, morally wrong. The fact that her eating wouldn't help them was irrelevant. She had to do this, had to maintain the connection through shared suffering. She was dying of starvation in a country with plenty of food, dying by choice, dying because her ethics demanded it. The doctors wrote in their reports that she was refusing nourishment. They didn't understand that she saw this as the opposite of suicide. This was love. Radical, absolute, incomprehensible love for people she'd never meet. She kept writing even in the sanatorium. Her handwriting deteriorated to the point of illegibility, but she filled notebooks with theological reflections, philosophical arguments, attempts to articulate what she'd learned. She was racing time, trying to get it all down before the end. Some of what she wrote was extraordinary, clear thinking about grace and necessity, about how God acts in the world through love rather than power, about attention as a form of prayer, about the way beauty breaks through the mechanical necessity of nature to reveal something beyond. These were insights that would influence theology for decades after her death. Some of what she wrote was disturbing. The embrace of suffering had become absolute. She wrote about the beauty of affliction, about how pain could purify the soul. She seemed to be arguing that suffering was good in itself, that the more you suffered, the closer you came to God. This wasn't Christian masochism. It was something stranger, a philosophy that took the crucifixion as its model and pushed the logic all the way to its conclusion. If God became human and suffered unto death, then suffering must be the path. The way to know God was to share in that suffering. Not symbolically, actually. You had to let yourself be crushed, destroyed, reduced to nothing. Only then could you know what Christ knew on the cross. Only then could you love as God loved. This was the theology she'd been developing since sola messe, since the moment Christ took possession of her. It had started with beautiful insights about grace and attention. It had ended here, in a sanatorium, with a woman starving herself to death in imitation of a love she believed required complete self-annihilation. Her friends who visited were horrified. She looked skeletal, her eyes huge in her wasted face. She could barely speak, but she was calm, almost serene. This was what she wanted, what she'd been moving toward all along. The contradiction at the heart of her life had reached its conclusion. She believed in life, in beauty, in the goodness of existence. She'd written passionate defenses of the world against those who despised it. But she also believed that the self had to be destroyed, that you couldn't love truly while still clinging to your own existence. The two beliefs couldn't be reconciled, so she enacted both. She loved the world so much she had to leave it. She believed in life so intensely she had to die. On August 24th, 1943, Simone Weil's heart stopped. She was 34 years old. The coroner's report listed the cause as cardiac failure due to myocardial degeneration of the heart, tuberculosis, and starvation. Then added, the deceased did kill and slay herself by refusing to eat whilst the balance of her mind was disturbed. That last line became controversial. Her friends protested. She hadn't been insane. She'd been enacting her beliefs with absolute consistency. But the coroner couldn't classify intentional starvation any other way. If you refused food until you died, that was suicide. disturbed balance of mind was the only explanation that made legal sense. Was it? Or had she been the sanest person in the room, so sane she could see what everyone else missed, that the world's suffering demanded response, that you couldn't claim to love humanity while living comfortably, that every bite of food you took while others starved was a betrayal of the love you claimed to feel. She died believing she'd failed to get herself parachuted into France, failed to make anyone understand her philosophy, failed to do anything that mattered. She didn't know that her notebooks would be published, that her writings would be read by people across the world, that she'd be recognized as one of the most important religious thinkers of the 20th century. She died thinking she was nobody, a failed activist, an unpublished philosopher, a woman who'd accomplished nothing except writing some essays nobody read. She had no idea she was leaving behind a body of work that would trouble and inspire readers for generations, that her insights about attention and grace and suffering would reshape how people thought about spirituality and ethics, that her life would become a question everyone who encountered it had to answer. They buried her in a Catholic cemetery even though she'd never been baptized. Someone made that decision, someone who understood that technicalities didn't matter. She belonged there, in ground consecrated to a faith she'd loved but never formally joined. The grave marker was simple, her name, dates, nothing else. Her parents were devastated. They'd lost their daughter to something they couldn't comprehend. Selma never recovered. Bernard tried to understand, reading Simone's writings, but the philosophy that made sense on the page became unbearable when you remembered it had killed your child. Her brother André became the guardian of her intellectual legacy. He edited her notebooks, worked to get them published, defended her reputation against those who saw only madness in her death. He understood something the coroner hadn't, that Simone had been following a logic to its conclusion, that her death was the final act of a life lived with absolute coherence. The first collection of her writings appeared in 1947, Gravity and Grace, assembled from her notebooks. It revealed a mind unlike any other, a philosopher who wrote like a mystic who thought like a philosopher, someone who'd managed to hold together political radicalism and Christian theology, Greek philosophy and factory labour, intellectual brilliance and bodily self-destruction. Readers didn't know what to make of her. Some saw a saint, others saw a cautionary tale about the dangers of taking ideas too seriously. Some found profound wisdom in her writings. Others found a mind that had lost touch with reality. Nobody could ignore her. Nobody could dismiss her completely. She demanded response. The argument started immediately. Was she a genius or mentally ill? A martyr or a suicide? A prophet or a fool? The categories didn't fit. She exceeded them all. She'd lived in a way that made ordinary classifications meaningless. What she'd written kept working on people. The essays on factory labour, the reflections on force and the Iliad, the theological notebooks with their strange insights about grace descending like gravity, about attention as prayer, about the necessity of waiting in emptiness for God. These weren't comfortable ideas, they asked too much. They suggested that everything about modern life was wrong, and that the only solution was complete transformation of how we lived. Most readers took what they could use and left the rest. The insights about attention, yes. The theology of affliction, maybe not. The political analysis, certainly. The embrace of starvation, absolutely not. You could learn from her without following her all the way to the end, but the end kept haunting people. You couldn't separate the philosophy from the death. She'd meant them to be connected, had lived and died to prove they were. If you took her ideas seriously, you had to confront the question, did they lead inevitably to self-destruction? Or had she made a mistake, pushed too far, misunderstood her own insights? The question matters because her insights were genuine, about attention, about grace, about the nature of affliction, about how love requires seeing clearly without illusion or self-deception, about how the self gets in the way of truth. These weren't wrong. They were profound, but they'd killed her. Simone Adolphine Weil was born on February 3rd, 1909, died August 24th, 1943, lived 34 years, wrote thousands of pages, changed how people thought about God and suffering and what it means to pay attention to the world. Left behind a legacy nobody could categorize or dismiss, became immortal by destroying herself. That was the paradox. The ideas worked. They transformed how people understood suffering, attention, and love. But following them to their logical conclusion had destroyed the person who discovered them. Her notebooks began circulating in France. Gustave Thibon, the farmer she'd worked for during the grape harvest, assembled selections under the title Gravity and Grace. The book appeared in 1947 and immediately divided readers. Here was someone who wrote about God with the precision of a mathematician, who discussed grace using the language of physics, who made mysticism sound logical and logic sound mystical. The Catholic intellectuals embraced her. Finally, someone who understood that Christianity wasn't about comfort or consolation, someone who'd grasped that the cross meant something brutal and real. She'd written that affliction was the condition that makes God appear absent when he's actually most present, that suffering creates space for grace, that we have to decrease so God can increase. This resonated with post-war France, a country that had been occupied, humiliated, forced to collaborate, that had watched its Jews deported while most people did nothing. Weil's theology of affliction spoke to that experience. It suggested suffering could have meaning without making it beautiful or desirable. But others recoiled. T.S. Eliot, who'd admired some of her work, called her thinking morbid. He recognized genius but worried she'd confused self-destruction with sanctity. Georges Bataille praised her courage while questioning her sanity. The boundaries kept blurring. More books appeared. Waiting for God collected her letters to Father Perrin, along with essays she'd written in Marseille. The Need for Roots presented her ideas for rebuilding French society after the war. Oppression and Liberty gathered her political writings from the 1930s. Each volume revealed different facets of the same obsessive intelligence. Readers noticed patterns, how every topic circled back to the same themes: attention, decreation, affliction, necessity, grace. How she approached politics through metaphysics, and metaphysics through lived experience. How nothing was ever abstract. How every philosophical concept had to prove itself in factory work or field labour. Her influence spread in unexpected directions. Albert Camus wrote about her with reverence, calling her the only great spirit of their time. Susan Sontag studied her obsessively, while also recognising the danger in her example. Iris Murdoch drew on her ideas about attention and moral vision. Simone de Beauvoir remained ambivalent, admiring the commitment while rejecting the self-erasure. The philosophical establishment didn't know what to do with her. She hadn't written systematic treatises. She'd never developed a complete theory. Everything came in fragments, notebooks, letters, essays written for obscure journals. There was no Weil system to analyse and critique, yet the fragments kept working on people. The essay on the Iliad became required reading for anyone thinking about violence and war. Her analysis of how force turns people into things, how Homer understood this in ways modern writers had forgotten, how the poem shows warriors and victims both as human beings caught in mechanisms larger than themselves. Her factory writings influenced later labour movements, not because she offered solutions, but because she described the problem with unbearable precision. The way work organised for efficiency destroys the soul, how repetitive labour prevents thought, how being treated as a tool makes you into a tool. She'd lived it, documented it, theorised it from inside. The theological notebooks proved most difficult. They required readers willing to follow her into territory where philosophy and mysticism merged, where she wrote about supernatural love as a kind of impersonal force, where she insisted that God's absence was a mode of his presence, where she claimed the soul must be emptied to be filled. These ideas came from direct experience, she insisted, not from books or tradition, from what had happened to her in that chapel in Assisi, from the months of reciting George Herbert's poem until Christ came down and took possession of her, from hours spent trying to practice the attention she'd theorized about. But how do you verify mystical experience? How do you distinguish genuine religious insight from psychological disturbance? Weil's readers split on this question. Some recognized authentic spirituality. Others saw delusion, projection, the mind interpreting its own states as supernatural intervention. She'd anticipated this problem. In her notebook, she'd written about the difficulty of discerning true grace from false consolations, about how the ego can masquerade as God, about the need for what she called decreation, the process of undoing the self's claim to be the center of reality. Decreation was her answer to the mystical tradition's talk of union with God. You couldn't unite with God because that implied two things merging. Instead, you had to uncreate yourself, not destroy yourself, which would be suicide, but undo the illusion that you were a separate, autonomous being. Accept that what you called I was a perspective God was having, not a thing that could possess or be possessed. This was philosophy at its strangest and most radical. It made Heidegger look conventional. It made the existentialists seem like they were still trapped in the ego they claimed to have transcended. Weil was proposing that the self, as we normally understand it, was a mistake, an error that had to be corrected through a kind of voluntary self-erasure that wasn't suicide. Scholars debated whether this made sense, whether it was coherent or contradictory, whether you could eliminate the self without eliminating the person doing the eliminating, whether this was profound wisdom or conceptual confusion dressed up as mysticism. Meanwhile, her personal legend grew. Stories circulated about how she'd given away her salary to striking workers, about sleeping on the floor in solidarity with refugees, about refusing anesthesia during dental work because soldiers in the trenches couldn't have it, about the rations she'd insisted on in London. Some stories were accurate, others were exaggerated or invented. The line between biography and hagiography blurred. She was becoming a symbol, a figure onto whom people projected their own ideas about commitment and sacrifice. The Catholic Church never canonized her. She'd refused baptism, criticized the Church's history, questioned core doctrines. But many Catholics venerated her anyway. She'd lived what they aspired to. She'd taken the gospel seriously in ways that made ordinary practice look like compromise. The problem was that taking the gospels that seriously seemed to require dying. If you really loved your neighbour as yourself, if you really gave away everything to the poor, if you really turned the other cheek and went the extra mile, you'd end up like Simone Weil, dead at 34 of self-imposed starvation. This created an uncomfortable question for Christians. Was she showing what genuine faith looks like? Or was she a cautionary example of taking metaphors literally? When Jesus said, "Deny yourself and take up your cross," did he mean it the way Weil had taken it? Different readers answered differently. Some saw her as a saint who'd understood Christianity better than the Church did. Others saw her as someone who'd confused neurosis with holiness. Both groups found evidence in her writings. What nobody disputed was the quality of her mind. Even critics who thought she'd gone mad acknowledged the brilliance. The way she could connect ancient Greek philosophy to modern factory work. How she read Homer and saw force as the fundamental reality of human existence. How she understood that attention was both an intellectual practice and a spiritual discipline. Her writing style itself was strange. Short paragraphs, aphoristic statements, sudden leaps from one topic to another, everything in notebooks that mixed philosophy, theology, mathematics, observations about daily life. She'd never revised for publication, never organised her thoughts into systematic form. Yet the fragments held together, each notebook entry connected to others through recurring themes. You could open her writings anywhere and find the same preoccupations: gravity and grace, necessity and freedom, the supernatural and the natural, force and love, attention and affliction. She'd been working out a philosophy of existence that took both poles seriously: the mechanical necessity that governs matter and the grace that transcends it, the force that treats people as things and the love that sees them as persons, the attention that reveals reality and the illusion that obscures it. This dual vision came from her dual training. She'd studied mathematics and philosophy simultaneously. She understood both the necessity of natural law and the freedom of consciousness. She could think like a scientist about matter while thinking like a mystic about spirit. She refused to choose between them. Most philosophers picked one side. Materialists said everything was matter. Idealists said everything was mind. Weil insisted both were real and the relationship between them was what mattered. Gravity pulling things down, grace pulling them up. The soul caught between, having to choose which force to align with. The metaphor came from physics, but the meaning was theological. We're attracted downward by our own weight, by selfishness and comfort and survival instinct. Grace pulls upward but doesn't compel. We have to consent to it. We have to want to decrease so something greater can work through us. This was why attention mattered so much. Because attention meant seeing reality instead of projecting our desires onto it. Seeing other people as they actually are instead of as extensions of ourselves. Seeing ourselves clearly instead of through the fog of self-justification. She'd practiced this kind of attention in everything. In her factory work, paying attention to exactly what the repetitive motion felt like. In her study of Greek, paying attention to the precise meaning of each word. In her prayer, paying attention to the silence instead of filling it with words. The practice had costs. Attention meant vulnerability. It meant letting reality affect you instead of protecting yourself from it. It meant feeling the worker's exhaustion, the refugee's desperation, the soldier's terror. It meant the world could hurt you because you'd stopped defending against it. Most people avoid this kind of attention. We look away from suffering we can't fix. We distract ourselves from truths we don't want to face. We construct narratives that make us comfortable. Weil refused all of this. She looked directly at what was unbearable and described it with precision. This was what had killed her. Not the tuberculosis exactly. The tuberculosis was what happened to a body weakened by years of refusing to protect itself, by solidarity with the hungry that meant starving herself, by attention to others' suffering that meant neglecting her own needs, by love that demanded she decrease so others could have more. Her death proved her philosophy worked, or proved it didn't work, depending on how you looked at it. She'd lived with absolute coherence, every action aligned with her principles. She died because living that way was unsustainable, which meant either the principles were wrong or human beings can't actually live according to truth. This was the question her legacy posed, not whether her ideas were interesting or profound. They obviously were, but whether they were livable, whether you could actually structure a life around them without ending up dead before 40. The answer seemed to be no, which left readers with a choice: take what was useful and ignore the rest, or conclude that truth itself might be incompatible with survival, that seeing clearly might require sacrifices we're not willing to make. Her work in London revealed one final contradiction. She wanted to help France, but refused positions that would actually be useful. The Free French assigned her to write reports and analyses. She produced them, brilliant and impractical. Plans for frontline nursing units that would follow troops into combat, proposals for spiritual reform of post-war France, ideas about what the resistance meant philosophically. Maurice Schumann, who'd recruited her, read her submissions with growing frustration. She had the clearest mind he'd encountered, and she kept proposing things that would get her killed immediately. The nursing corps plan was typical. She wanted to be parachuted into occupied France with medical supplies, to move with advancing troops, treating casualties under fire. She insisted this would boost morale by showing soldiers they wouldn't be abandoned if wounded. The military implications were obvious to everyone, except her. Nurses required protection. They slowed troop movement. They became targets. The entire proposal demonstrated profound ignorance of how modern warfare actually functioned. But when people explained this, she persisted, as if moral necessity overrode practical concerns, as if wanting something intensely enough made it feasible. The pattern held across her work. She'd analyze a problem with extraordinary clarity, then propose solutions that ignored every constraint of reality. France needed spiritual renewal. True, but you couldn't legislate spirituality. Workers needed dignity. Agreed. But her suggestions for achieving it assumed everyone shared her capacity for self-sacrifice. She lived in a rented room, barely eating. The landlady noticed, but Weil deflected concern. She was fine, just busy with work. The tuberculosis progressed, but she avoided doctors. Partly she believed French refugees shouldn't consume medical resources needed for the war effort. Partly she was implementing her theory of decreation, making space for grace by reducing her own presence. The notebooks from this period show her thinking becoming more abstract, less concerned with immediate political questions, more focused on ultimate spiritual ones. She wrote about the Cathars, medieval heretics who believed physical existence itself was evil, about Plato's forms and how particular things participate in eternal patterns, about the difference between natural necessity and supernatural grace. Someone reading these notebooks without context might think she'd retreated from the world. Actually, she'd gone deeper into it. The political writing and the mystical writing weren't separate projects. They addressed the same question from different angles. How do you live in a world structured by force without being corrupted by it? How do you remain human when everything pushes you toward brutality or submission? Her health collapsed completely by summer. The coughing got worse. She couldn't hide it anymore. Someone finally convinced her to see a doctor. The diagnosis was immediate: advanced tuberculosis. She needed rest, good food, medical treatment. She refused all three. The doctor explained she was dying. She nodded. Did he think she should eat more? Yes, obviously, but she couldn't. Not while people in occupied France were starving. The doctor pointed out that her dying wouldn't feed anyone in France. She agreed this was true, but she couldn't do otherwise. This is where the logic of her thought led. You can't separate yourself from others' suffering. Their hunger is your hunger. Their pain is your pain. Not metaphorically, actually. So eating while they starve means participating in an unjust distribution. The only honest response is solidarity. Concrete, physical, enacted through your own body. The hospital staff found her impossible. She wouldn't eat. She filled notebooks instead of resting. She asked for Greek texts and mathematical treatises. She wanted to work, not recover. They tried explaining that recovery required cooperation. She smiled and returned to her writing. Albert Camus later said she had a sadness that was unbearable to witness, that being near her made you aware of how much suffering existed in the world, how inadequate any response was, how complicit we all are in systems of oppression. She made people uncomfortable by embodying truths they preferred to ignore. The final writings circled around a single question: what does God require from human beings? Not what does religion require? What does ultimate reality demand if you take it seriously? Her answer kept coming back to attention and consent, paying attention to what actually is rather than what you want to see, consenting to reality instead of demanding it conform to your preferences. This sounds passive, but it wasn't. Attention meant seeing clearly. Consent meant accepting what you saw rather than lying to yourself. Most people can't sustain this. We construct narratives that make us comfortable. We avoid looking at what's unbearable. We pretend our choices don't have consequences we'd rather not acknowledge. We'll refuse these comforts. She looked directly at what was unbearable. Factory workers degraded by repetitive labour, soldiers destroyed by violence, refugees stripped of everything. And she insisted on staying conscious of it, on letting it affect her, on bearing witness through her own existence. The cost was her life, but she believed consciousness itself was sacred. That awareness was the only thing that made humans different from machines. That the ability to see clearly and think truthfully mattered more than survival. She was willing to die to prove this, or she died because she believed it. Same thing either way. She stopped eating entirely near the end. The doctors called it suicide. She called it solidarity, with occupied France, with the hungry, with everyone suffering while others remained comfortable. The distinction mattered to her, even if it looked identical from outside. On August 24th, 1943, her heart failed. She was 34 years old. The death certificate listed cardiac failure caused by tuberculosis, with starvation as a contributing factor. The coroner's report noted she'd been eating approximately nothing. Her body weighed next to nothing. She'd physically disappeared herself. The burial happened quickly. Wartime London, a Jewish refugee who'd never converted to Christianity. A few people attended. Most who'd known her were elsewhere, fighting or hiding or dead. The grave was marked simply, Simone Weil. The dates, nothing about her work or thought or what she'd tried to accomplish. Her notebooks remained. Thousands of pages, dense, difficult, profound. Her parents saved them. Gustave Thibon had some. Father Perrin kept letters. After the war, people started publishing selections, first in French, then in translation. The books appeared under titles she hadn't chosen: Gravity and Grace, Waiting for God, The Need for Roots, Oppression and Liberty. Readers discovered a thinker unlike anyone else, someone who'd taken philosophy seriously enough to live it completely, who'd refused every compromise between truth and comfort, who'd died rather than accept contradictions between her ideas and her actions. The response was immediate and divided. Some people found her work revelatory, others found it disturbing, many found it both. Albert Camus published her work at Gallimard. He wrote that she was the only great spirit of their time, that her integrity was absolute, that she made everyone else look compromised. T.S. Eliot championed her in England, Czesław Miłosz in Poland, Susan Sontag in America. Each generation discovered her again and argued about what she meant. The debates continue. Was she a saint or was she mentally ill? Visionary or fanatic? Prophet or cautionary tale? The question assumes these categories are opposites. Maybe they're not. Maybe someone can be all of them simultaneously. Maybe that's what happens when you refuse to protect yourself from reality. What's undeniable is that she thought more clearly about suffering than almost anyone. She understood how modern systems degrade human beings, how force corrupts everything it touches, how difficult it is to remain conscious when consciousness means pain. She described affliction with precision that makes you flinch, because she'd experienced it herself, deliberately, repeatedly. This was her method. Experience first, analysis second. She didn't theorize about factory work. She worked in factories. She didn't speculate about war. She went to Spain. She didn't imagine hunger. She starved herself. The knowledge came from her body before it reached her mind. This is what made her descriptions so exact and so unbearable. The legacy is complex. You can't simply adopt her ideas, they killed her. But you can't dismiss them either. They're too precise, too honest, too aware of things most philosophy ignores. She saw connections others missed, between manual labor and spiritual practice, between attention and love, between decreasing yourself and experiencing grace. Her influence shows up in unexpected places. Activists cite her understanding of oppression. Mystics study her theology. Political theorists use her analysis of force. Poets respond to her language. She belongs to no single tradition because she challenged all of them. Christians claim her, but she refused baptism. Marxists cite her, but she rejected the party. Jews remember her, but she converted in everything except name. Maybe this is appropriate. Her whole project was about refusing to belong to any group that would require lying, about maintaining the ability to see clearly, even when truth contradicted your tribe, about being loyal to reality rather than to convenient fictions. This made her homeless in every sense, physically, politically, intellectually, spiritually. She had nowhere she fully belonged. The question her life poses isn't whether her conclusions were right. It's whether thinking clearly requires the kind of extremity she practiced, whether you can see reality accurately without being destroyed by what you see, whether consciousness and survival are ultimately compatible. She seemed to believe they weren't. That awareness cost too much, that most people have to choose between truth and life. Her answer was to choose truth, completely, without compromise or hesitation, to let the cost be whatever it was, to decrease herself until there was room for something beyond herself to appear. This is what she meant by decreation. Not self-destruction, but self-emptying. Making space for grace by getting out of the way. Whether grace actually appeared is a question each reader has to answer individually. What's certain is that she disappeared, deliberately, methodically, as an act of philosophical and spiritual commitment. She thought her way to a conclusion and then enacted it with her body. The integrity was absolute, and it killed her, which means either she was right and the cost of truth is death, or she was wrong and took her ideas too literally. There's no comfortable middle ground. This is why her work remains disturbing. Not because the ideas are strange. Many philosophers have strange ideas, but because she lived them completely. She proved they were either livable or they weren't, and the proof came back fatal. That's the legacy. A body of thought so coherent that testing it meant dying, and a death that validated or refuted everything, depending on your perspective. 70 years after her death, we're still arguing about what she meant, still trying to decide whether to call her a genius or a warning label, still picking through her notebooks, looking for the moment where clarity turned to something darker, as if finding that moment would resolve anything, as if we could separate the insights from the life that produced them. But there is no separation. The philosophy and the body were the same project. She wasn't writing about attention and then separately starving herself. The starvation was attention to hunger, to what millions were experiencing while she sat in safety, to the weight of privilege that made her complicit even when she didn't want to be. Most people read her work and take the parts that seem useful. The essay on force and how it turns people into things, the analysis of factory labor and mechanical repetition, the observations about how modern life severs us from what makes existence meaningful. You can extract these insights, apply them, benefit from them, without following her all the way to the sanatorium, without ending up dead at 34 with a coroner ruling your mind was disturbed. That's probably the wise approach. Learn from her without becoming her. Appreciate the clarity of her vision without accepting that clarity requires self-destruction. Acknowledge that she saw things most people miss, while also acknowledging that what she saw drove her to conclusions most people can't accept. But doing this means accepting a contradiction. The insights were real because she lived them completely. The factory writing works because she actually worked in factories until her hands bled. The theology resonates because she experienced the mystical states she described. The political analysis cuts deep because she'd been on the bottom and understood from inside what oppression felt like. You can't have the insights without the life that produced them. But the life that produced them was unsustainable. So we're left reading someone whose thoughts we value while knowing we can't follow where those thoughts led her. Admiring her commitment while hoping never to match it. Finding wisdom in writings produced by someone who couldn't survive her own wisdom. The alternative is concluding she was simply wrong, that her philosophy failed because it killed her, that any system of thought that leads to death is self-refuting, that survival matters more than consistency, that you can't love humanity in general while destroying your particular human body. This is defensible, maybe even correct, but it doesn't explain why her work keeps affecting people, why readers 70 years later still find themselves troubled by what she wrote, why her analysis of affliction feels more relevant now than when she first articulated it, why her understanding of how force operates in modern systems seems to predict developments she never witnessed. The work survives her, that's undeniable. The books keep getting translated, republished, studied. New readers discover her and go through the same process. Initial fascination with the clarity of her thinking. Growing unease as the implications become clear. Final confrontation with the question of whether she was right to live and die the way she did. No consensus ever emerges. Every generation splits the same way. Some see a saint, others see pathology. Most see both and can't reconcile them. The woman who gave away her salary to striking workers, who joined an anarchist militia despite her pacifism, who worked drill presses until she wept, who refused food while others starved thousands of miles away, who wrote about God with a precision that made mysticism sound logical and logic sound mystical. She wanted to understand suffering from the inside. She succeeded. The knowledge destroyed her, but it was genuine knowledge. She wanted to live without complicity in unjust systems. She failed. Everyone fails, but she tried harder than almost anyone else. She wanted to experience grace without earning it. She claimed it happened. We have only her word. What we're left with is a collection of writings that refuse to resolve into comfortable conclusions, that keep pushing against easy answers, that insist reality is more complex and more demanding than we want to admit, that suffering means something beyond economics or psychology, that attention is both simpler and harder than it sounds, that love might require losses we're not prepared to accept. Her life didn't prove these things true, but it demonstrated what taking them seriously looks like. The cost and the clarity both. The way following logic to its conclusion can lead somewhere most people won't go. The question of whether reaching that place means you were right or wrong. The question remains open because it can't be closed. She died in 1943, but the dilemma she embodied didn't die with her. It resurfaces whenever someone asks what philosophical consistency requires, whether intellectual honesty demands living according to your stated principles, whether there's a point where commitment becomes pathology, whether consciousness and survival are ultimately compatible goals. These aren't academic questions, they're personal ones. Everyone who reads her work has to decide what to do with what she wrote, how much of it to accept, where to draw the line between learning from her and becoming her, whether the insights justify the cost or the cost invalidates the insights. Most people draw the line somewhere. Take the analysis of attention and leave the theology. Accept the political critique, but reject the mysticism. Admire the factory writings while recognizing the experiment was unsustainable. This is reasonable. This is how you learn from someone without being destroyed by what destroyed them. But making these choices means accepting that you're choosing comfort over consistency, that you're not willing to follow the logic all the way to its conclusion, that survival matters to you in ways it apparently didn't matter to her, that you're compromising between truth and livability in ways she refused to compromise. This doesn't make you wrong. It might make you sane, but it does mean you're different from her. that whatever clarity she achieved came at a price you're not willing to pay, that her insights remain available, but the intensity that produced them stays locked behind a barrier most people won't cross. She knew this would happen. Near the end, she wrote about how truth might be incompatible with ordinary human life, how seeing clearly might require sacrifices that make clear seeing impossible to sustain, how the world is structured such that wisdom and survival work against each other. She was describing her own situation, documenting the trap she'd walked into deliberately. Whether she escaped the trap or died in it depends on what you think escape means. If escape means surviving to old age and publishing your work and being recognised for your contributions, she failed completely. If escape means achieving clarity about what matters regardless of the cost, maybe she succeeded. The answer determines whether her death was tragedy or completion, whether we should mourn her or understand that she got what she wanted. Her parents couldn't answer this. They just knew their daughter was gone, that her brilliant mind had pushed her somewhere they couldn't follow, that the notebook she left behind contained thoughts they could barely understand, that strangers would read her work and argue about its meaning while they lived with the absence she'd created. The strangers did argue, still are arguing, about whether she was right to refuse baptism, whether her factory experiment proved anything, whether her mystical experiences were genuine or symptoms, whether her death was suicide or martyrdom or something that transcends both categories, whether we should study her work or warn people away from it. All these arguments miss something. They treat her as a problem to be solved, a puzzle to be figured out, a case study in what happens when philosophy becomes too real. But she wasn't trying to be a case study. She was trying to live honestly, to think clearly about suffering and force and grace, to understand what modern civilization was doing to human beings, to figure out whether God existed and what that meant if he did. These were genuine questions for her, not academic exercises. She pursued them with everything she had, followed them through factories and war zones and mystical experiences, and finally to a sanatorium where she chose solidarity over survival. The questions led there. That's what happened when you refuse to stop asking them. Whether the questions should be asked at all is itself a question. Maybe some forms of inquiry are too dangerous. Maybe certain truths can't be pursued without destroying whoever pursues them. Maybe wisdom requires knowing when to stop thinking, when to accept conventional answers and live within their protective boundaries. Simone Weil never learned this, or learned it and rejected it. She kept thinking past the point where thinking was safe, kept following logic past the point where logic served life, kept trying to align her existence with her understanding even when alignment meant disappearing. That's what we're left with. A body of work that demonstrates both the power and the danger of absolute intellectual honesty. That shows what happens when someone refuses every compromise between truth and comfort. That proves you can think your way to places human beings can't survive. That leaves us grateful for the insights and disturbed by their cost. She wrote once that contradiction is the lever of transcendence, that the places where our concepts break down are where reality reveals itself. That confusion and paradox point toward truth more reliably than systematic clarity. Her life embodied this. She was contradiction incarnate, pacifist soldier, atheist mystic, Jewish Christian, factory-working philosopher, someone who loved life so much she had to leave it. The contradictions don't resolve. They sit there in her work and her life, refusing to be explained away, insisting that reality is stranger and more demanding than our categories allow, that the questions matter even when the answers are unbearable. That consciousness means staying awake to things that make you want to sleep. She stayed awake. That's what killed her. She saw clearly and kept seeing clearly even when clarity meant agony, even when it meant recognizing her own complicity in systems she opposed, even when it meant understanding that solutions weren't available and the suffering would continue regardless of what she did. Most people can't sustain that level of awareness. We have to look away sometimes, have to forget temporarily what we know about how the world works, have to pretend our choices don't have the consequences they have. Otherwise we'd be paralyzed. Otherwise we'd be Simone Weil, dying in a sanatorium at 34. So we learn from her at a distance, read her books and discuss her ideas while maintaining the separation that kept her isolated. Appreciate her courage while lacking it ourselves. Benefit from her clarity while refusing the practices that produced it. This is how influence works. The saint or prophet or genius, whatever you want to call her, goes to the extreme so the rest of us don't have to. Lives the logic fully so we can extract lessons without following the same path. But something's lost in that extraction. The intensity that made the insights possible. The absolute commitment that let her see what others missed. The willingness to be destroyed by what she discovered. You can't transmit these things through books. They exist only in the living of them. And most people won't live that way. Can't live that way? Shouldn't live that way. Which means her most important insights remain locked inside an example we can't follow. We have the words she wrote, but we're missing the experience that gave them meaning. We have the conclusions, but we're avoiding the premises that led there. We have her work, but we've lost the life that was inseparable from it. Maybe that's acceptable. Maybe it's necessary. Maybe learning from her without becoming her is exactly what she'd want. She never asked anyone to follow her, never presented herself as a model. Just thought out loud and died young and left her notebooks for people to interpret however they needed to. The notebooks remain. That's enough. Not enough to answer all the questions her life raises. Not enough to resolve the contradictions she embodied. Not enough to tell us whether she was right or wrong about the fundamental questions. But enough to keep us thinking. Enough to prevent comfortable conclusions. Enough to remind us that clarity has costs we keep forgetting to count. Simone Adolphine. Weil lived 34 years, wrote thousands of pages, worked in factories and fought in Spain, and experienced mystical possession and starved herself to death in solidarity with people she'd never meet. Left behind work that troubles everyone who encounters it, became immortal by making herself disappear. That's what happened. What it means is still being decided.